Hello, and welcome to Remember the Film, the podcast where whenever we think we're out, they pull us back in. My name is Josh Bradley, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Jeff Grizz Ulrich.
Hello.
And Hugo Panay.
Pajama le mani.
Okay, yeah. So we're going to be doing that a lot this time. Today we're talking about the Godfather of movie trilogies, which is, of course, The Godfather.
The Godfather.
Earlier this week, last week, Francis Ford Coppola released a not only remaster but also a re-edit of the much maligned Part 3, somewhat maligned Part 3.
Kind
yeah.
of.
And now
I was surprised when I was just doing research about this.
Certainly maligned in comparison to Godfathers 1 and 2.
For sure.
Which
absolutely.
we'll talk about, yes. But he re-edited it so much that he gave it a new title. It's now called The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a longer title, but more descriptive. But also...
I've got feelings on that. We're going to get into that.
Okay. And I want to say this up front because I just had to say the main character's last name. We have a native Italian speaker on this podcast, and I'm not one of them. So I'm gonna say Corleone and Mario Puzo and Sollozzo and things like that. And Hugo will say
Michele Corleone.
You sound a lot better,
actually. Because they say them wrong in the film anyway. So
right. Hold up.
Not
they
wrong.
Don't say them wrong. They say them like they live in the United States.
Yeah.
And they live in the United States.
Yes, but they're supposed to be Italian.
Of Italian descent.
No, they're Vito Corleone, Vito, whatever.
Okay, he's actually Italian.
He's actually Italian. You know, they still say Corleone.
Okay. Yeah,
Michael spent some time
Corleone.
The point is, I'm going to say Corleone, buongiorno, grazie. I'm going to say things like that because I could try to say Michael Corleone, but I sound ridiculous. I don't like sounding ridiculous, so
that's fine.
I'll leave it to Hugo.
That's totally fine.
Grizz and I will leave it to Hugo. All good.
Agreed.
Yeah. Anytime there's a name to be pronounced, you just shut up and I'll
point at you.
Yes. I'll do the dub.
Margaretti. Okay, so we're the reason for the season is to discuss Part 3, or the new cut of Part 3, or the death of Coda, the death of Michael Corleone. But I think it'd make more sense for us to just kind of go in order and talk about all three movies, starting with the original from 1972. So quick boilerplate stuff. Again, released in 72. Coppola was apparently the 13th choice by Paramount to write and direct this movie. It was originally offered to Sergio
Leone. Sergio Leone. Yes.
Just end every sentence like it's a question and you're speaking Italian. Leone?
What? Leone? Yes. Sergio Leone, of course, then eventually went on to make Once Upon a Time in America, which is his idea of the big mob epic movie.
How long after The Godfather did that come out?
Quite a long while.
Yeah,
I think that came out in 1984 or something. It was the 80s anyway, so gotcha. It's quite a while later. But there are similarities between the films, and obviously he was attached to this, or at least the studio wanted him to direct this because at the time he was coming off the success of his, the Dollars trilogy, and then Once Upon a Time.
Can confirm it was 1984.
No, not in
America.
America.
Time in America.
So even though Paramount may have wanted Sergio Leone, they went with Coppola, and I think it worked out for everyone involved. This movie grossed $246 million on a $6 million budget. It was the highest grossing film of all time until Jaws a few years later. Nominated for 7 Oscars, won 3, including Best Picture, Best Actor for Marlon Brando, and Best Adapted Screenplay for Coppola and Mario Puzo. And now it's widely considered maybe the best American movie ever made. We just talked about Citizen Kane last week, and one of the main competitions for Citizen Kane's title of Best American Film Ever is The Godfather. So here we are talking about The Godfather.
Yes, it's definitely in that type of higher echelon of the Mount Rushmore of movies, or whatever you want to call it.
I think it's probably fair to say this is more widely seen than Citizen Kane. What do you guys
Absolutely.
think? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I think so. Also, because what's interesting about this film, it's not that it's just considered one of the best, but given the situation in which it was made, considering that this was, a director who wasn't really a well-known name. He was casting people who the studio didn't want.
Right.
He had trouble during production. It was a complicated film, and it could have been a disaster, but somehow it managed to be not only one of the best films of all time, but also an incredible success at the box office.
Very much
which
so.
is something that you might not have expected for something like this.
Well, and then you compare that with like Citizen Kane, which was not the complete box office success that it probably should have been because of campaigns against it.
Right.
So I definitely think Godfather is more widely seen in its time as well as today.
Right. And Hugo mentioned a troubled production. The studio didn't want him to cast Marlon Brando. I guess he was considered kind of like well past his prime by that point, and Coppola wanted to take a chance on him.
It's not that exactly. I think the real reason was at the time he was considered to have anger issues. His movies lately hadn't made a lot of money, and he had always been a problem during production because he
famously
was
difficult to work with. Yeah,
very, very difficult to work with. But Coppola was so convinced that he would be perfect for this role that he actually went to meet Brando at his home and recorded a quick sort of audition tape of him he basically Brando chose to have cotton balls in his mouth to do the famous, to have the famous Godfather look.
Yeah.
And Coppola apparently sort of sneaked this audition tape into all the audition tapes that they were making, that the studio was actually doing, and then the studio realized, he's perfect for this role, we have to get him. But
earlier this week, Coppola sat down with Bill Jabiri, and there's an interview that went around. It's in Vulture, and I encourage everyone to read it. But it's really good. But he said that if he ever met a genius in his life, it was Marlon Brando. Like, Marlon Brando was the most genius person he had ever worked with, which I think is a high compliment for someone who made the movies that Coppola has made. He was famously difficult on set, but I also think that he was also just like a really, by all accounts, he's like a really smart guy who just didn't suffer fools.
Yes.
And had high expectations for people, and that doesn't excuse a-hole behavior, but it might explain it a little bit. Also, outside of casting Brando, this is Al Pacino's second feature film, and talk about catching lightning in a bottle to cast Pacino and what he would go on to do.
Yeah, and it would start a run for both. This film started a run for both Coppola and Pacino, where Pacino in 4 years made the two Godfather movies. He worked with. Then he made Dog Day Afternoon and
Serpico was in between the Godfathers, actually.
Yeah, all in the span of like 3 years. Mm-hmm. And then Coppola made so much money with this movie that he was basically free to do whatever he wanted for the next decade.
For the next decade, at least, yeah.
Yeah, for the next decade, he was completely free to do whatever he wanted. And he just made masterpiece after masterpiece for the whole of the 70s. I was just making a list of my favorite 70s movies recently, and I think all four of his movies of the 70s, which are The Two Godfathers, The Conversation, and Apocalypse Now, are in my top 10 of that decade, because they're all so great. And then what he did afterwards was basically he used all of his money that he had made over that time to set up this independent studio that wanted to compete with Hollywood. And the first movie he made with that was a complete failure. And so for the rest of his career, he would be in financial difficulty. So he sort of had this incredible moment in time where he was at the top of his game. And then he never quite really managed to get back to that. But I mean, whatever, regardless of that.
Yeah,
Grace, you haven't talked a lot. How do you feel about The Godfather?
I absolutely love it, and we were talking about, and we'll get to it more when we're talking about our rankings. But like comparing it to movies like Citizen Kane, it is very clearly on that echelon. But I think that The Godfather is a much more universally interesting story. That there's you can't necessarily relate to The Godfather. Like I'm not a mob boss. I have no experiences of being a mob boss, but there's emotional resonance in the choices that he makes that like you can almost justify some of the things that they do. There's some things you really can't, but I find myself attached to the idea of someone who has made horrible decisions in their life trying to transition into a more sustainable and good lifestyle. And and we see that. I mean, we're going to see that's a common theme throughout all three of the Godfather movies. And also, I can relate to self-destruction. Messing up your own goals because you perceive that you have to, things like that. Getting in your own way. So I just think it's, despite being a movie about a subject that almost no one has any first-hand experience with, it's something that everyone can still relate to.
I think it's actually more relatable than maybe something like Citizen Kane because it's a period piece. Even though it was made in the 70s, it takes place in the 40s, I want to say. Yeah. So they're not really trying to capture the now, and that makes it less dated.
It takes place just after World War II.
Right. Yeah. And so the fact that
in the first scene, Michael has just come back.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Come back from the war. He's a war hero. And so I think that, even in the 70s, it's already looking back at something and kind of recreating a world instead of trying to create the world around that it existed in. And that, again, that kind of makes it age less than something like Citizen Kane would, which is, taking place at a very 1941 moment.
Yeah, it sort of makes it feel like a timeless story, even though it's very specifically set in a specific time.
Mm-hmm.
But,
in terms of influence, one of my favorite movies of all time is Goodfellas, and Goodfellas is so in conversation with The Godfather in interesting ways. Someone put on the outline about how Michael and Vito are on opposite trajectories, and that's very astute. I always connected Michael and Henry Hill and Goodfellas, and how both The Godfather and Goodfellas are kind of two-part movies, where it's in Goodfellas it's a rise and a fall, where the second half is a lot more scarier than the romanticization in the first half. But The Godfather's kind of, I feel all romanticization to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do you guys think?
I think it's a tragedy.
It is a tragedy. I think the arc of The Godfather's tragedy. I think the part one in isolation is, the shiny good parts before the tragedy.
Sure.
I guess. You know what I mean?
What I mean with Godfather 1 being a tragedy is that you take a man who he's an adult. He went off and fought in the war. He came back. Michael Corleone's a war hero. He's got a love interest. Everything's going on the path that everyone wanted for him. Even his family had, his father.
I always thought you'd be a senator or whatever.
Yeah. They all had great aspirations for Michael that were completely away from the family business, and so it's a tragedy to me in that and the self-destruction, as I already mentioned, he brings this down on himself through decisions he makes, and it makes me so sad because I like movies and stories where there's a good guy, right? I like the good guy.
Yes.
And Michael Corleone was the good guy at the start of the movie, and he's not the good guy at the end of it.
But the things that bring him in, are kind of little by little somewhat defensible.
That's what I'm saying. You can justify some of it.
Yeah, he goes to visit his father in the hospital. He's been shot, and he notes that his guards have left and realizes that someone's going to come kill his father. So he has to pretend to be a gangster to keep them from doing that. That's his first foray into the business, is acting like he has a gun so that people won't kill his dad.
And it's in defense of his family,
Extremely, yes. And then he gets punched in the face, and then things unravel a bit.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Hugo.
And even right after that, the first thing he does is just protect his father, who might be killed. Then the scene after is him realizing he's the only person in the family who can take care of this crisis, and he chooses to take charge in some of a reluctant way. He doesn't want to be the head of the family necessarily, but Sonny dies at some point, but I think Michael understands that he is the smart one, the one that has enough calm, the one that can distinguish. The one that can distinguish between business and personal in a way that Sonny can't.
Sonny can't. Who is Fredo's not Sonny smart enough.
Can't. Fredo's not smart enough. So he finds himself basically having to take over the family just out of not wanting all of his family to end up in a war that goes on forever. But then initially he would like to make the family legitimate in 5 years, but then he slowly, little by little, small decision by small decision, becomes more and more ruthless, and he ends up being this evil character. He ends up being this ruthless mob boss, even more so than his father ever was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really interesting art.
I mean, it's fascinating, and like I said, I like stories where I get to root for the good guy, but the quality of this movie and the quality of the storytelling, I still really enjoy this like abundantly, despite the one guy that I want to root for going way downhill in my eyes.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. I have seen part one, like I've seen part one a lot, and I haven't. I only saw part two for the first time this week, and I saw Coda for the first time this week, obviously. So like, it's interesting that like I kind of only stick to the good part of Michael's story, or quote unquote the good part of Michael's story.
Right.
He goes bad pretty quickly. Also in part one, it's just not as bad as what happens in 2 and 3, I guess. Real quick, final thoughts on final thoughts on part one. Anything? Favorite scenes?
Oh yeah.
Well, actually, I think there's two things we need to talk about.
Okay.
First, the cinematography is genius.
I was going to say
the way
Gordon Willis. Gordon Willis. Sorry.
Yeah, Gordon Willis, I think is his name. But the way he chooses to use lighting, it's always lighting from above, and it creates this darkness in the faces, and the eyes make a shade, and it just sets a perfect mood. And it has this like sort of, it's not an orange filter. It's sort of, he underexposed the image in order to make it look more orange and more warm, but at the same time it has a lot of darkness, and I think it's just perfect. Any interior scene in this movie is just spotless. Well, absolutely genius.
One thing that I want to touch on is just the quality of the casting. I know that that Hugo has issues with pronunciations and things like that, but
not in this movie,
not so much with this one. Robert Duvall as Tom, is a very underrated part of this movie, and that's hard. It's hard to say that about Robert Duvall, but he's instrumental in this movie, and he becomes the character that I like that I can relate to the most.
I agree. Yeah.
Him and Kay, I think, are the two.
Well, and Kay for sure as well. Diane Keaton,
early Diane Keaton, like 5 years before Annie Hall.
It's unbelievable the quality of this cast, especially as you said with the the issues they had getting it off the ground in the first place, and it's just everyone delivers an excellent performance in this movie, and I cannot say that about every movie down the line. So
We'll get into that. Anything else on part one, Hugo?
I'm not sure. Well, not going into specific scenes, because I think what's incredible about this film is that every scene is iconic.
It is.
There are several. I don't know. There's 10 scenes in this movie that I think are iconic. I mean, my favorite is probably the baptism scene, where they do the montage, where he's baptizing his it would be his godson, his nephew actually, but he's also the godfather of the nephew.
Also very
which is
borrowed.
Interestingly enough, borrowed by what?
That's also borrowed a lot. That sequence, I'm thinking about Breaking Bad. End of season 5 of Breaking Bad is just ripping off that sequence left and right. Yeah. Yeah,
and the child in the sequence, interestingly enough, is Sofia Coppola, which is cool. Which is a funny
little. And her screen debut.
Her screen debut, yes, as an infant, and the way they cut back and forth between him, pronouncing the words that the priest is telling him to say and renouncing Satan or whatever, and at the same time,
all those things are happening that he's
all of his people to kill all the other bosses at the same time in order to become the only real mob boss in New York. I think that sequence is incredible.
What's your favorite scene, Josh?
Salazzo McCluskey, the midpoint at the Italian restaurant, easily. Yeah. I don't have to say anything besides that. Grizz?
As far as favorite scenes, I mean, it's tough to pick, as you said. I love Leave the Gun, Take the Cannoli.
Yeah.
Yes. And what about look at how they massacred my boy.
Look how they massacred my boy. Yeah. Which again kind of rhymes with part 3 as we'll get into a bit.
It's so good. It's so good.
Yeah.
But let's transition
Brando
to...
is just incredible.
And Brando was incredible, but we could not get him back for part 2.
No.
As I I guess he wanted too much money for part 2. I don't know. Anyway, Godfather Part 2.
He dies in the first one.
I know, but there are flashback scenes, aren't there? There's a scene at the end.
But
Brando actually had to be written out of the final scene of Part 2.
Yeah,
they had to rewrite it like the day before they shot it, I think. He was supposed to be in it. Okay, Godfather Part 2, released in 1974, 2 years later. Paramount immediately wanted to make a sequel. I'm pretty sure before The Godfather even came out, they were already asking him about a sequel just based on like the dailies they were seeing and like the early cuts they were seeing. Actually, I think Coppola said they were still in production. They were still shooting The Godfather when Paramount's like, we're gonna make a part 2, right? And he didn't want to, but Paramount gave him creative control. And we already talked about that The Godfather was a pretty troubled production. Godfather Part 2 apparently was not at all a troubled production. In that interview I talked about earlier with Bill Jabiri, Coppola had said it was the smoothest production he ever had in his career, which is interesting because like this is a pretty wide-spanning movie. They shoot in Tahoe, they shoot in Europe, they shoot in period setting New York City. So like there's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of settings. They shot for like over 100 days, so I would think that would be a troubled production, but he said it was really smooth. Grossed $48 million on a $13 million budget, nominated for 11 Oscars, won 6, including Best Picture, first sequel to ever win Best Picture. And one of my favorite pieces of movie trivia is that De Niro won supporting actor, so he and Brando are the only people to ever win an Oscar playing the same character. Which is
they're not recently. The only people until recently, because it happened a second time.
Yes, that's true.
With Joker.
Kind of.
I mean, it's different versions of the Joker.
It's a different canon. It's different
are you going to say that Heath Ledger's Joker is Arthur Fleck? I don't think so. That's
okay. I get what you mean. But come on, it's the same.
But now this is going to be something that people
and makeup.
This is something that people are going to argue forever. Does it count?
Yeah, but definitely this is the only time it was the actual same character.
Right. And here's another piece of trivia. How many other sequels have won Best Picture? I'm asking both of you right now.
I have no idea, because the only thing I can think of is a possibility of Empire, but I know they didn't win an Oscar with that, so I'm really not sure.
No, I can't think of any. I can think of some that won Best Animated Picture. But
what about Return of the King?
Return of the King is one. Count? That's one that counts.
Oh,
and a lot of people.
Go ahead.
Say again.
Go ahead.
A lot of people think that's the only one, but fun fact: Silence of the Lambs is technically a sequel.
Okay. I was about to get there, actually.
Manhunter was made in 1986 with Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter, and that is technically the first movie in the Thomas Harris books about Hannibal Lecter. So, technically speaking, different cast, different filmmakers, different everything. But Silence of the Lambs is the second book in a series about Hannibal Lecter, so technically that is also a sequel. That one Best Picture, but that's that's kind of a sneaky piece of movie trivia.
Yeah, it's a bit of a stretch, but it checks out.
But also Return of the King.
Return of the King.
Return of the King.
I started to say The Dark Knight, and I was like, hang on, I don't think that didn't win.
No, there was a whole thing about it not even being nominated.
Do you know what won Best Picture the year Dark Knight came out?
I'm sure you'll tell me.
I don't want to know.
Millionaire.
Oh, that's right. I actually do enjoy that movie.
Millionaire. Yeah, it's a lovely movie. Lovely movie.
It's a good movie.
Yeah, it's not The Dark Knight, but I like that movie.
It's not The Dark Knight.
So, Part 2, Godfather Part 2, Al Pacino's back as Michael, but it cuts back and forth between Michael running the family business in the 50s and his father, Vito, as his rise to what he became at the start of Part 1. And again, De Niro plays young Vito in Sicily and in New York. And actually, so I mentioned earlier that Coppola didn't want to make a sequel, and I read in that interview that I keep citing that when Paramount approached him about a sequel, he thought that he always had like this idea in his mind to do a movie about a father and a son at the same age, where like you go back and forth between the father in his early 30s and the son in his early 30s, and like in the early scenes you see the son as like a baby, and in the later scenes you see the father as like a decrepit old man, and kind of just like the parallels between those two. And he thought, well, I can kind of do that as a Godfather movie. That's like something I've always wanted to do, so let's just do it here. And he did, and it's awesome. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, it's pretty great. I don't think it's as good as the first one, just because I think most of what is great about this movie is because it's quite similar in the way it's shot and the way it's made and in the way the storytelling works and in the performances to the first one. So the first one is the groundbreaking one, which, you know, influenced mob cinema forever. And the second one is more, which is still fantastic. And I think the movie is still a masterpiece, but I don't think it has as much of a... It isn't as strong as the first one. And I also, you know, I have a bit of a... It sort of bugs me on the flashback side, but I think we'll get into that.
Go ahead and jump into it, because I've been thinking about this.
Okay. So first of all, which part do you? I know it's a whole movie. It's parts of a whole, but which part are you more interested in? The Vito story, rising up and becoming sort of a mobster and the Godfather, or the story of Michael Corleone, or whatever you guys pronounce his name? Which part do you gravitate more towards?
That's a good question. I think they're both,
because for me it's Michael.
I was going to say,
for me it's easily Michael.
For me, I gotta say they're neck and neck, and I think
they are.
That's why I like this movie so much, is because they do such a great job of paralleling the stories, but they're parallel, but it's again that opposite trajectory. Again,
and
go ahead.
And they also kind of, like, you know, Michael. I'm curious. I'm invested in Michael's story because I'm kind of just waiting to see how low he'll go, because I know that he's going to go pretty low and get to dark places, and I'm just curious as to how far. Vito, on the other hand, we see in the opening scene, like, where he starts from, which is a 9-year-old boy alone in a country with mobsters trying to kill him, and, like, we know where he ends up because we've seen the first movie, so, like, just, like, to start there and end where we know what we're ending, like, is very interesting, and I'm very curious as to how he's going to get to where he gets based on where he starts, so that's also interesting in its own right.
But Hugo, you had mentioned you also had a problem with De Niro's portrayal, right?
It's not I don't have a problem with it. He won an Oscar for this. It's a great performance, and I'm sure it's incredibly convincing for an American audience or an international audience. But as somebody who is a native Italian speaker, it's really hard to watch these scenes with De Niro because the Italian is just not there, and a lot of the time he's acting with Italian actors, and if everyone was American, it was all pretense, and I could suspend my disbelief a bit more, and you know, I realize that the Italian is not great, but it doesn't really matter. But he's often acting with actual Sicilians, and so whenever he's speaking, he speaks mostly Italian for most of the movie, De Niro. So whenever he speaks, I hear this contrast constantly, and it just breaks immersion for me. It makes it really, 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 really hard for me to suspend my disbelief in those scenes.
I will say that I noticed that he does, like, at times seem to be doing a Brando impression.
That's what I thought your problem was going to be. Was
at other times he's not. Yeah.
I don't really mind the Brando impression because maybe I've seen De Niro in so many films, and he has that demeanor, and I don't think it's too much of an impression. He does have a bit of that aura to him, even in the way he moves and the way he emotes. But it's actually just the language, and I don't blame him. I think he's doing a good job considering he's not an Italian speaker. Like, the fact that he's even able to get through a whole movie of this level of gravitas, speaking another language, is impressive.
So he's not a speaker. So you just do it phonetically? You just, like, taught him his lines phonetically. Then, I guess
I'm sure he can speak a bit of Italian because he's he's a Italian American, and a lot of them know a bit, like a few sentences or words, but you can absolutely tell that he was not born in Italy and definitely not in Sicily. So it is a bit distracting for me, as much as, and I don't. You know, it's not a fault of the movie. It's not a fault of De Niro.
And there's no way that
it's just something that distracts me.
That there's no way that the Brando impression that he's doing is affecting his pronunciation. You don't think it could be any of that?
I don't think so. Because Brando's pronunciation, because he uses Italian so little, he only says a few words here and there, so it works. It works quite well. It's just that saying full sentences in a language that you don't know. That you don't really know, and it's not just Italian, it's the Sicilian dialect, which is quite specific.
Sure.
It makes it really hard. But again, let's not that's very much a me thing.
Right.
But the movie as a whole, I think, is brilliant. Anyway,
one thing you mentioned, Hugo, that I want to touch on is that you said you've seen De Niro and so many other things besides this, so you know what kind of caliber of actor he is. I think that actually really worked in the movie's favor for me. Again, this week was the first time I'd ever seen it, which is crazy, I know, but it's the youngest I've ever seen Robert De Niro. I've never seen him younger than this in a movie, and so I have a relationship with Robert De Niro from like the 80s and the 90s. Like I have I'm in awe of an older version of this character I'm seeing on screen, which works because he's playing Vito Corleone as a young man. So like the audience is supposed to be in awe of who this man will eventually become, and I personally am in awe of who Robert De Niro will eventually become. So it kind of works on that level. Also, shout out to
the casting choice was fantastic. I think he has a similar aura to him, and his screen presence works for that character, for sure.
Yeah, and again, kind of just like part one, it's kind of lightning in a bottle getting Robert De Niro in 1974, a pre-Taxi Driver De Niro, a pre-Raging Bull De Niro. It's kind of crazy that he did it twice. Coppola did it twice with his casting.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. And speaking of casting, shout out to Bruno Kirby, who plays young Clemenza. As I was watching this, I'm like, is that the guy from When Harry Met Sally? And yes, that is indeed the guy from When Harry Met Sally.
The guy from Harry Met Sally.
That's Jess, who ends up with Carrie Fisher, which, just any reason to bring up When Harry Met Sally? Yeah, I'm gonna take that. So
yeah, fair enough.
So favorite scenes? Anyone have a favorite pick?
For me, it has to be I don't know if it's a specific scene, but I think the second half of Michael's story, he's getting more and more paranoid about all his enemies around him. He's getting more and more ruthless. And there are a few scenes where he just loses it, because he's been a calm and collected presence throughout, the whole first movie and the whole first half of the second movie. And then at one point, he's so tired, he's so paranoid, and he hates that he has to be the Godfather, that he starts snapping at people, especially at Robert Duvall as Tom. There's a few scenes where he just loses his mind and he goes from 0 to 100 in a second. Those scenes are just absolutely brilliant. I love his performance.
In that regard, that's one of my favorites.
He's really menacing.
Is at the party in Cuba, where he grabs Fredo by the head.
Yes.
I have the picture up on screen now, but he grabs him by the head. It had to be. I knew it was you, Fredo.
You broke my heart.
You broke my heart. Love that.
And even that scene. And even that scene in the beginning where the senator comes to visit him, and the senator starts to get aggressive against him, and so he just sits back and he's like, "Here's my offer." Nothing.
Love it.
That scene is so good because
awesome.
He has that presence. He's so understated, but at the same time he feels menacing every time he speaks.
That's a quintessential Pacino moment.
Yes,
he's at his best when he's being quietly menacing, and that scene in particular, it's really, really powerful stuff. Another one of my favorite scenes is from the De Niro storyline, young Vito, and that's when they're climbing across the rooftops. While he's following, I forget the guy, Minucci, and he's Fanucci. I'm sorry.
Yes.
He's following along the rooftops, and during the parade. I just think that one is it's a cool sequence narratively, but it's also a really cool sequence the way they shot it. Because anytime you get that many extras on set, and there's all this action, it's your eyes drawn all over the place, but somehow they keep you focus. You're focused on the same thing that young Vito is the whole time.
Yes.
Really it's all on location, so it makes it even more impressive. What about you, Josh?
I think that's also my favorite scene in part 2 is when Vito takes out Fanucci, and it's interesting that my two favorite scenes in the first two movies are like the equivalent of each other in their respective movies. Like that scene is the equivalent of Michael taking out Salazzo McCluskey in part 1, and I think the reason I like both of those, not only is that like the start of both of those men's journeys on the paths they go down, but also from like a filmmaking perspective, particularly the Salazzo scene in part 1, like both of those moments are like they tell you what they're gonna do, and then like 10 minutes later they do it. So like it's a, you know, it's there's a lot of tension, and then there's a release of that tension. Like nothing goes wrong in the Sollozzo McCluskey plan, and nothing goes wrong in Don Vito's plot to get Finucci, but like they still just like show you the entire process. They tell you it's going to happen, show you the entire process, and then it happens. It's just very good tension and release in those sequences, I think. Yeah.
Yes, and in both movies, I think the very final scenes are both absolutely fantastic. So in the first one, where you know he lies to Kay and says the family is going to be legitimate, and you know I'm going to fix everything.
Now you say that's a lie. I don't think that he views that as a lie. I think he intends.
He doesn't want it to be, but
yeah, he intends to go legitimate.
Well, he does lie to Kay, like in that scene. Where,
he does lie in that scene about like, no, I didn't do it. You know.
Yes. Like, kill Talia Shire's husband or whatever.
Yeah. Like you did, but but he wasn't lying about wanting the family business, to become legitimate.
Yes. So good segue, because parts 2 and 3 basically end almost exactly the same, depending on whether you watch Coda or watch the original part 3.
Pretty much the same. I mean,
yeah. So, Godfather Part 3, the original theatrical release of Part 3, came out in 1990. Again, written and directed by Coppola and Mario Puzo, excuse me. And 16 years after Part 2, even though it made money at the box office, and this was nominated for Best Picture. Like, we consider this movie a failure, but it was nominated for Best Picture. Even so,
which was
had
surprising to me.
Right, but it much more mixed reviews than for the first two, and this is considered the Fredo of the Godfather movies, if you will.
Poor Fred.
Where much maligned, or maybe not much maligned, but very maligned with respect to the first two.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about Part 3. I'm going to start by talking about our relationships to Part 3 before we saw Coda. So, and we all have different experiences. For example, I have not seen Part 3. I have only seen Coda. What about you guys?
I had seen 1 through 3. I watched them a couple of years ago, so this was not my first time. And for our purposes of our film to remember being Coda, I also rewatched the original Part 3 before watching the Coda, so I could see, what the changes were and how necessary they were.
Yes. So you're comparing your viewing of Coda to, like, you've already seen Part 3 before you saw Coda. Okay.
Correct.
And Hugo, you're the opposite, right?
I saw Coda first, and then I went back. I didn't rewatch all of Part 3 because I just didn't have time, but I went back and saw the different scenes and the way the beginning is different and the slight differences at the end. But to be honest, for me, yes, Coda is a little leaner, and I think
it's 10 minutes shorter.
It's 10 minutes shorter, which,
that goes a long way for me.
Does it? It's still 2 hours and 40. So
for me, at that point, this experiment
of
re-editing was the most unnecessary thing.
I think the new ending is a slight improvement. I think it sets up what is actually happening
I want
in a
to
much
ask
more interesting way.
Josh, are you going to mind if we spoil some of the differences between Coda and the original Part 3?
No, I want to get into that in detail. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, there are the differences are essentially very minor. The scene where he makes the deal with the Vatican, basically, which is sort of half an hour into Part 3, is the opening scene in Coda. Mm-hmm. And in Part 3, it was half an hour later. So I think putting that scene at the beginning and cutting out that sequence that they had in Part 3. In Part 3, they have the sequence where he receives the medal from the Vatican, which is why they're having that party, right? Mm-hmm. At the beginning.
Yeah.
That's the reason, because he received this honor for his philanthropic work.
And they also
they cut out that scene.
The letter where he's writing to his kids to ask them to be there happens, at the beginning.
Right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning. And then that's why his kids are at the medal ceremony.
Yeah, I think that scene of him making the deal sets up what the conflict is in the movie sooner, and so I think it makes it work a little better. But overall, it only cuts out a few scenes here and there. The ending, yes, it's a few seconds difference, but it doesn't really change anything.
It's a big few seconds, though.
It is, but
a lot happens in those few seconds.
Can I be honest? The changes with the church at the beginning, cutting out the medal ceremony basically entirely.
Yeah.
From for Coda, like it's a scene that probably went on longer than it needed to in the original, but it sets up the importance of the church in this film much more than you get in Coda. You see, this is again Michael trying to become legitimate, and he's trying to use the church to do that, and through the most illegal, illicit ways possible, of course. Yeah. But it's part of that goal of trying to get to where he doesn't have to be the Godfather. He doesn't have to, they don't have to do these crimes anymore. And I think that they set up the relationship that he has with the church, which comes up again later when he meets the then cardinal who is going to become the Pope. And so the church is a very important role in this movie, and they cut out most of the church in the Coda.
In the beginning, yes.
Sure. I think that what he said in his review is he wants to, I think that moving around the first scene is actually a much bigger change than you guys seem to be giving it credit for. I think that really primes the audience in a different way to and attunes them into what kind of movie we're in and changes the focus quite a bit. So I think that's a pretty big change. And I understand, especially if he's trying to cut 10 minutes out of this movie and make it leaner. I understand him moving that scene to the opening. His meeting with the Vatican is the first scene. I also understand what they are probably going for with the original cut, which is they're mirroring the original Godfather, which opens with this extended, 25-minute long wedding scene that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the story. It's more of a prologue situation, and then the main plot begins. Then the main plot begins with the Salazzo meeting, again, about half an hour in. So that's kind of what they're doing. What they were doing with the original Part 3 was this long ceremony that's kind of setting up stuff for later payoff, but it's more just
it's world
showing
building
them as a family. Yeah, and then half an hour in is the meeting with the Vatican that begins the main plot.
And I guess I can see it's fair in in Coda that and this is the third part of this trilogy, that you don't necessarily need to build the world so much anymore, because anyone who's watching Part 3 has watched Parts 1 and 2.
Particularly the fact that you're cutting this movie 30 years later. You are acknowledging how, the cultural consciousness of Michael Corleone is different now even than 1990.
But I kind of appreciated the religious setup, in Part 3 more than in Coda. And maybe that's just a personal preference, but I thought that it really drives home the skeeziness of his goal in this movie, using religion to purify his money, to purify his his business.
Yeah.
And and it's a twisted thing. And of course, the church has a pretty dark history.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, this
the thing
fits
the thing
that
for
narrative
me is
as well.
The thing for me is, by putting that scene of the meeting with the church at the beginning, it sets up this idea that the church is in on it. The
I don't
church
mind
is corrupt in that moment.
The move of that scene at the beginning. I just wish they had.
Oh, you mind the cutting out? Okay.
I mind the cutting out of the medal ceremony.
That's a fair point. Yeah, I don't think it achieves much by just cutting out 10 minutes. I think the move is good, but I agree. Just having 10 minutes off, okay, it changes a little bit, but it's the same movie. It's the same story at the end of the day.
So I'm kind of actually curious to check out the original Part 3 myself, because one thing I noticed while watching Coda, and I don't know if this is just part of the editing down process or if this was in the original, but this is a subtle nitpick, but it's important. It's not as good at with its cinematic language, if I can use that phrase. Grizz, you mentioned the sequence in Part 2 where we're tracking Vito along the rooftops. We're also tracking Finucci, and we're also, at a parade. So there's a lot of moving parts, but it's still always very clear what we're looking at and following the motion, and the cuts work and the editing works and all that kind of stuff. That's just good filmmaking, and it's something you kind of take for granted when it's not that good. And in Part 3, there are sequences where what we do see of the medal ceremony, for example, at one point Andy Garcia kind of interrupts it, and everyone kind of hushes and looks at him. And then we get a reaction shot from Michael, and I didn't even know Michael was in the scene. You know, like, I feel like I didn't get a sense of where he was relative to the other characters, and then suddenly we just see, like, a reaction shot of him in isolation with no one else around him. I'm like, where is he positioned in this room? And, like, that's a small nitpick, but that's, like, important. And there's, like, that's one example, but there's several scenes like that where I kind of didn't really have a good bearing on, you know, where people are in a room or who's even in the room and that kind of thing.
I think completely agree. And it's an issue not just with individual scenes, but with the storytelling as a whole. I think the film is a bit confusing, and it's not always clear what is going on. It's not always clear who the enemies of the families are. You know, it's kind of hard to follow. I think the first half of it is pretty solid, right up until the point where he gets the stroke, and then from then on, it becomes quite difficult to follow. They go to Sicily for reasons that I don't really understand.
His son's performing
and it just
in an
sort of
opera.
devolves. I think.
His son's performing in an opera. That's why they go to Sicily.
You know, I get that, but I don't understand narratively. I understand the reason within the story, but I don't understand why they made that choice in the writing.
It's a little forced. It's like a plot contrivance to bring them, like, well, we got to bring them to Sicily, so...
Right. Yeah, but why? It could have been set in New York. I don't really get what the real reason is. But go ahead, Josh.
You said something that I want to touch on. You said that it's kind of confusing. There's not a lack of clarity. I would actually argue that all three Godfather movies have a bit of a clarity problem, in terms of, you know, but I think that in parts 1 and 2 that's a little bit more intentional, where like there's a line between mystery and confusion, where like you have this mystery, you don't know who to trust. Is it Sollozzo? Is it Tattaglia? Is it Barzini? You know, Tessio, etc. Like, but I think in part 3 you really get more into the confusion of the confusion mystery spectrum, and like all three are convoluted, I think purposefully, but less. Part 3 is it doesn't come together as much.
It doesn't come together in the
parts
end.
1 and 2.
Yeah. Part 1 and 2 are convoluted, but it's to build the sense of paranoia that the protagonists are feeling. In this one, it's just not as well told, and it's not quite clear why we should care, who the enemies are, and why.
So the question that I keep coming to in part 3 and in Coda, because it's basically the same thing, is like I end up having to stop for a second and think, wait, why are they killing this guy?
Exactly.
What was the reason that set them on this again? Because it's not as clear cut. It's not like, oh, he put a hit out on my son, so now I'm it's.
And like
this
guy's a banker, so we kill him because he's a banker, I guess.
Yeah, and there are characters that are friends a second before, and then a second later they're not. But it's not quite clear what the reason is, because even when there was betrayal in the other movies, it was always, oh, this man is paying me more, or I have this reason. Like Fredo has an emotional reason why he betrays the family, and then that's the reason why he gets killed. But Altobelli, who's the character played by the ugly in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, I don't know the name of the actor, but it's him.
He looks like Mel Brooks to me.
He does look a lot like Mel Brooks.
Yeah. Well, all of a sudden he just turns on them, and I think he was the one who set up.
I think the implication is that he's been setting them up the whole time, but it's not as clear.
Again, it's just not as clear. You don't have the clarity. Yeah.
Also, that guy's an overactor.
Oh yeah.
So.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay. Please, Michael, let me talk to him. Give me a second, buddy. Come on.
The acting in part 3 is, I think, much discussed. So.
I
have so many.
Sofia Coppola is kind of. I think she takes a lot of the brunt of the part 3 criticism, which is something I've always known, but again, this is the first time I've ever seen part 3/Coda. It's baffling to me that she took the brunt of the criticism.
Yeah, I think that's unfair. It's unfair to put it all on her.
Yes,
she's bad, but it's definitely.
I actually don't think she's bad. I don't think she's bad at all. Maybe there might be more scenes of her in the original part 3 compared to what I saw in Coda, but she is completely fine in the scenes that I've seen in Coda. So like honestly, like Andy Garcia is really going for it in some scenes, and I'm kind of raising my eyebrows at his performance far more than I am at Sofia
I agree.
Coppola.
I expected more from Andy Garcia. The part where he's talking to Tony Montana. when he's talking to him, Joey Zaza.
Right.
Joey Zaza,
Say it to his face one time! I was was like, oh,
we should kill these guys. Yes.
Andy Garcia is doing a Sonny Corleone impression.
Yes.
He is.
And he didn't know him. He didn't know his dad.
And Sonny makes sense, first of all, because he's second-generation Italian. So the more even the accent that he has is sort of more contextualized. And the performance was always on the edge of being too much, but they made it work within that movie. Garcia just feels unrealistic for a person in the 70s who is third generation.
And then they keep, and this is a guy they keep giving more responsibilities to. He's flying off the handle all the time.
Exactly. I don't get why Michael would leave him. Even, yes, he's had a stroke. Yes, he doesn't want to be the Godfather anymore. But he's such a smart character. He wouldn't give the family to another Sonny.
You know who he should have given the family to?
Yeah.
His sister.
Yeah.
Or Tom's kid. Well, I guess Tom's kid was a priest by that point.
Yeah.
I do want to say, though, in Andy Garcia's defense, in the third act of this movie, he kind of settles into what I'll call a Terry Benedict mode. What I know Andy Garcia the most from is Ocean's 11, which I've seen 1,000 times, and he plays Terry Benedict, and he's like this ruthless, smooth, smart, in control of everything guy, and he kind of settles into that during the opera sequence, I think.
Yes.
By the way, the opera sequence is fantastic.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that the payoff is maybe a little too foreshadowed, but that whole sequence of the opera in the last 40 minutes of this movie is amazing.
Yes, it's not just that it's too foreshadowed.
I called him Tony Montana. It's Joe Montana. I'm sorry. I always do that.
Well, Tony, Joe, Sonny, it's those. But even that scene, the killer, who is this assassino, as they call him, who's never failed in his whole career, he walks up to Michael and he's a few meters away and he misses and he shoots the daughter. I just don't, it's little things like that. L'assassino professionale non ha mai fallito. They say that in Italian. He never failed. He's a professional assassin. He worked for the mafia for 30 years. He's never failed once. So it's little things like that happen throughout the whole movie. I don't know. I feel like it's death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. Like I said, I think that payoff is maybe a little too foreshadowed. There's not as much. There's very little subtlety in Part 3. Not that the Godfather movies were ever subtle to begin with, but Part 3 really kind of pulls off all the facade. And my favorite scene is the confession scene. That just is a great scene.
It's a great scene.
Throw that out there. Yeah,
it's great acting.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that's what sets that scene apart so much in this movie is, especially with, like, again, I'm making jokes about the acting. It's not like the worst acting I've ever seen by any means, but that scene stands out because both performances in the confession are excellent, and they are of the same caliber.
And a great character moment too for Michael. That's like his, like the character moment, maybe of the whole series.
And
and
forgive this question
again.
Was cousin marriage or cousin relationships a more common thing than I'm recalling? Because
I don't think so at all. I don't think so at all.
They don't they say it's wrong. It's wrong. He's your cousin, but it's also like,
Michael seems more concerned.
They don't really. Like, the thing is, what they say the most is it's too dangerous.
Right, exactly. Michael seems more concerned about that.
Because she's going to get killed. It's not so much that she's a cousin. Is that if she's married to the Godfather, she's going to get killed, or she's going to be in harm's way, or whatever.
I mean, it is. I already said that it was too foreshadowed, but it is a nice little bit of irony that Michael thinks that she'd be too dangerous with Vincent, but it turns out it was dangerous just for her to be with him. I mean, that's a nice little bit of irony.
I think that's great. For me, it kind of becomes the question of, was it really necessary for Vincent to be Sonny's child?
I mean, this whole saga is about family, so I kind of I see that.
Right, but so like I felt like there was an opportunity for the narrative to be that this guy Vincent, not Corleone,
Mancini. Mancini was his name at the beginning.
Just keep that name, sure. But he's just a guy who works for their family, and he's been working his way up through the ranks, and that when Michael's son decides that he is going to drop out of law school and he's going to be an opera singer, that it would make sense to me narratively for Michael to pick this guy Vincent as his surrogate son, and then you could still have all the other narrative beats, but also him not be related. And I don't think you lose anything with that.
You wanted Ray to be nobody. I hear you. I got you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. We got to wrap up. So, any final thoughts on Part 3 or Coda or the trilogy as a whole before we rank it?
Yeah, my only thing I think my final thought about Part 3 is I don't understand what the story wants to be. I don't get why they chose to have this story for Michael, because I think a really interesting story would have been, how does he come back from being so evil and come to the decision that he wants to really become legitimate, and then maybe he dies in tragedy or whatever, but he actually changes. Like what happens in this film, Michael's arc largely happens off screen. At the beginning of this film, he's already been trying to become legitimate, but the way we've left him in Part 2, the last thing he did was kill his brother. So he was at the lowest moment. He was at his most evil. And then we pick up in Part 3 and he's a sympathetic character again.
Yeah.
And that's my real...
I think they're able to get away with that a little bit because they waited so long after Part 2 to make Part 3.
And because Al Pacino is so good that he carries this sort of sense of a way... He has this sense that he's wasted his whole life, and he's able to communicate that because he's very good. But at the same time, I don't think it's as much of an interesting story. I don't think he has anywhere to go in this story, but either he dies or someone in his family dies. That's the only thing that can happen to him in this
story.
story.
That we see him reckon though with Fredo in Part 3. Like he calls out Fredo's name during his stroke, and then also has the confession scene. Great scene, it sounds like you wanted more reckoning with his actions.
Yeah, I wanted him to at the beginning be the evil, ruthless man that we've seen in Part 2, and the movie being about not his redemption, but at least his
attempt at redemption.
And I think it feels like he's already made that decision. He's already made that change before the movie even starts. And so the movie ends up being more about him, giving the family off to Vincent and
I do have one other thing that I wanted to touch on. And I think we mentioned that we were going to talk about it earlier, so I want to make sure we talk about it. The ending of this movie. It is different. It's a very small difference in terms of what you actually see on screen, but I think it's a very major difference narratively in that in Coda, it ends with Michael Corleone, looking up and then
old man Michael, and the light is the light becomes washes out the screen, and then you see I forget what the exact text was, but when they say, what is it, Hugo? When Sicilians say blank, they mean they're wishing you long life, and a Sicilian never forgets. Okay, so that's what they did in the Coda. In the original, he's also eating oranges.
I love that he's eating oranges. Yeah, I love that.
Yes, so much oranges.
Yes, great parallel.
But in the original, Michael is sitting there eating his oranges, with the puppies running around him and everything. And then he just kind of sits back and dies. And then he falls out of the chair comically. It's, it's somewhat laughable the way he just flops out of the chair and is dead. And I actually kind of love that, not because it's like, haha, funny, but like this is, this man was a ruthless tyrant, the leader of a international mob family, right? And when you die, everybody's the same when they die. There's no control. He's just. And I thought that was very poignant.
Too, right? Yeah.
It is poignant, but it's also already been done in the series.
But I don't mind that. That's a parallel.
Not as an
that's fair.
Though,
that's fair. But again, even if it's good, even the parts that are good, I don't think they're saying anything that hasn't been said in Part 1 or Part 2. Even when they work, it just feels a little unnecessary.
But I actually really enjoy that they're saying the same thing in part 1 and part 2 with the way his father died and the way Michael dies.
Yeah.
Is that it's the themes of the sins of our fathers, the repetition of mistakes, all that stuff. Yeah, it's saying the same thing, but in saying the same thing, they are saying something new, which is that they did not. Nothing that they did changed anything. Mm-hmm. He ended up with the exact same failures that his father did.
Yeah.
That's all fair and good.
I guess by cutting to black or fading to black before he actually dies, I guess that's kind of implying that he has to live with his sins for longer. Mm-hmm. That's what he's going for with Coda, I guess.
But I don't love that.
Okay.
I don't hate it. It's fine, but I don't think it did enough different to warrant that change, personally.
Sure. So, as the official film to remember, Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone, are we ranking just that in our film to remember rankings?
Yeah. Although I really wish we were ranking 1 and 2.
Otherwise, we would end up with a ranking of everything we ever talk about, and that would be.
I don't want
cool,
Godfather parts 1 and 2 to just sit at the top of our ranking in perpetuity.
Forever.
They probably wouldn't be topped. So let's talk about where part 3. A reminder of our current rankings. It's number 1 through number 6. Citizen Kane, The Thing, Rudy, Mank, Jackie Brown, and The Sugarland Express. So where do we think Godfather Coda?
Personally, it would probably go at the end of the list, behind Sugarland Express.
You like Sugarland Express more than you like The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone.
Yes, The Death of Mario Puzo's The Godfather, Coda, Electric Boogaloo, 5, The Revenge.
Where they save the rec center. Grizz, what about you?
I agree. Bottom of the list for me.
I would put it ahead of Sugarland Express. I think that this movie is actually still really good, even though it's not nearly as good as parts 1 or 2. It's still a very good movie.
I don't hate it. I enjoy the movie.
It's behind Jackie Brown, ahead of Sugarland Express for me, but it sounds like I'm being outvoted, and it is now number 7 behind Sugarland.
I think for me, it's just that Sugarland Express surprised me by how much I enjoyed it, and Godfather 3, despite still being a good movie, the Coda was ultimately a disappointment by comparison, and so maybe that's a little unfair, but that's how it is.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Anything else, gentlemen, before we wrap up?
Nope. Wrap it up.
No.
All right. Cool. Well, then, be sure to like, subscribe, share, write a review, all those things, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.